The November of 1894 descended upon London with a peculiar malevolence, wrapping the great metropolis in shrouds of yellow fog that seemed to muffle not merely sound, but reason itself. It was upon such a morning, when the gaslight struggled feebly against the gloom and the very air appeared thick enough to cut with a blade, that I found myself seated in our familiar lodgings at 221B Baker Street, attempting to make sense of a most extraordinary paragraph buried within the morning edition of the Times. The account was brief, yet it possessed that quality of understated sensationalism which the better newspapers employed when faced with events that defied conventional explanation. Under the modest heading "Disturbing Incident at Kensal Green," the reporter had chronicled a discovery that would have seemed the product of a fevered imagination were it not vouched for by no less an authority than the Metropolitan Police. Miss Constance Fairweather, aged 22, lately in the employ of the distinguished antiquarian Mr. Aldrich Pemberton of Belgravia, had been laid to rest in Kensal Green Cemetery following her untimely death from a sudden fever. The funeral, conducted with appropriate solemnity 3 days prior, had been witnessed by her employer, several domestic staff, and the attending physician, Dr. Marcus Whitfield. Yet when the groundskeeper had noticed a disturbance at the gravesite and summoned the authorities, the coffin was found to contain not the deceased young woman, but an assortment of weighted materials, bricks, iron bars, and what appeared to be a collection of old clothing arranged to approximate human form. The matter had been placed in the capable hands of Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, though the reporter noted with evident relish that even that seasoned officer appeared somewhat perplexed by the unprecedented nature of the circumstances. I had scarcely finished absorbing these remarkable details when the familiar tread of boots upon our 17 stairs announced a visitor. Mrs. Hudson's gentle knock was followed immediately by the entrance of the very inspector mentioned in the account, his usually composed demeanor betraying signs of considerable agitation. "Dr. Watson," Lestrade began without preamble, removing his hat to reveal hair dampened by the morning's fog, "I trust Mr. Holmes is available. I find myself confronted with a case that challenges every assumption I have formed regarding the natural order of things." Before I could respond, the door to Holmes's chamber opened with that precise timing which never ceased to amaze me, and my friend emerged, already dressed for the day and bearing that expression of keen interest which indicated his attention had been captured by our visitor's words. "Ah, Lestrade," Holmes observed, his grey eyes immediately cataloguing the inspector's appearance with characteristic precision. "I perceive you have spent the early hours among the monuments of Kensal Green. The particular clay upon your boots and the faint odor of recent excavation about your person suggest you have been investigating something far more intriguing than the usual run of domestic crimes." Lestrade's weathered features registered no surprise at this deduction. Long experience had accustomed him to Holmes's uncanny ability to read the evidence written upon a man's person. "Indeed, Mr. Holmes, I come to you with a matter so extraordinary that I confess myself entirely at a loss. We are dealing with what appears to be an impossibility, a young woman who has been buried twice, yet never properly interred at all." Holmes settled into his favorite chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin in that familiar gesture which indicated his complete attention. "Pray continue, Inspector. The morning papers have provided only the barest outline of what promises to be a most stimulating problem. The facts, as far as we have been able to establish them, are these," Lestrade began, consulting his notebook with the methodical precision that marked his professional approach. "Miss Constance Fairweather, employed as a companion to Mr. Pemberton's invalid sister, fell ill with what Dr. Whitfield diagnosed as a virulent fever. She died on the evening of November the 15th and was buried with appropriate ceremony 3 days later. The coffin remained sealed throughout, as is customary in cases of infectious disease. Yet, when exhumed, Holmes prompted, it contained only ballast materials." "Precisely, but that is merely the beginning of our difficulties." Lestrade's voice dropped to a more confidential tone. "Yesterday evening, A waterman discovered a body in the Thames near Wapping Old Stairs. A young woman, weighted down with iron chains, who had been in the water perhaps 2 or 3 days. The features were, well, the river had not been kind, but there were certain identifying characteristics. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his interest evidently piqued. Which were a distinctive birthmark upon the left shoulder, in the shape of a crescent moon, a gold ring bearing the Fairweather family crest, and most conclusively, a locket containing a miniature portrait of her late mother items, which Mr. Pemberton confirmed had been buried with Miss Fairweather. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant rumble of traffic in the fog-shrouded street below. Holmes rose and moved to the window, his tall figure silhouetted against the grey morning light. "Most illuminating," he murmured at length. "We have, then, a young woman who died of fever, was buried in a sealed coffin witnessed by several respectable individuals, yet whose grave contained only weighted substitutes, while her actual remains were discovered in the Thames, bearing the very items that should have been interred with her. That is the crux of our dilemma," Lestrade agreed. "How does one bury the same person twice, when the first burial never actually occurred?" Holmes turned from the window, and I recognized in his expression that particular intensity which marked the beginning of his involvement in a case that had truly captured his imagination. "Watson," he said briskly, "your coat and medical bag, if you please. Inspector, I believe a visit to both Belgravia and Kensal Green is in order. This case presents us with what appears to be a logical impossibility, always the most rewarding type of problem." As I gathered my belongings, I could not suppress a slight shiver that had nothing to do with the November chill. The fog outside seemed to press against our windows with unusual persistence, as though London itself sought to conceal the dark secrets we were about to uncover. Little did I know that before the week was out, we would indeed discover that Miss Constance Fairweather had been buried twice, and that both interments had been acts of murder most foul. The hansom cab that carried us through the fog-shrouded streets toward Belgravia moved with deliberate caution, the driver's calls to his horse muffled by the thick November air. As we navigated the barely visible thoroughfares, Holmes remained characteristically alert, though I suspected his attention was focused less upon the obscured cityscape than upon the puzzle that had been presented to us. "Watson," he began without turning from his contemplation, "observe the gentleman approaching on our left, the one with the distinctive gait and the foreign-cut overcoat." I peered through the fog and discerned a figure hurrying along the pavement, his posture slightly hunched against the damp air. "I see him, though I confess the details escape me in this murk. Note the slight burns upon his wrists, visible despite his attempts to conceal them with his cuffs, and the particular way he favors his right foot, characteristic of one who spends long hours standing upon stone floors. A chef, recently arrived from the continent, I should venture, who finds London's damp climate more challenging than the heat of his professional domain." Lestrade shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "No. And what, pray tell, has a foreign cook to do with our case of the impossible burial?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Nothing whatever, Inspector. But such exercises serve to sharpen the faculties before confronting the truly perplexing. In cases where the impossible appears to have occurred, success often depends upon the observer's ability to perceive what others overlook." As our cab drew to a halt before an imposing Georgian townhouse, Holmes finally turned his full attention to the matter at hand. "Now, gentlemen, let us consider the timeline that has been presented to us. Miss Fairweather allegedly died on November 15th, was buried on the 18th, yet the waterman's assessment suggests her remains had been submerged for only 2 or 3 days when discovered yesterday. The implications struck me with sudden clarity. If accurate, that would place the actual death at approximately the 19th or 20th, after the funeral had already taken place. Precisely, Watson. Either our waterman possesses remarkable skills of temporal estimation, or we are dealing with circumstances far more complex than simple grave robbing. The Pemberton residence presented an aspect of refined mourning appropriate to recent loss. The butler who admitted us, a man whose bearing suggested decades of faithful service, conducted us to a drawing room where artifacts and antiquities gleamed beneath glass cases, lending the space an air of scholarly distinction. Mr. Aldrich Pemberton proved to be a gentleman of middle years, his scholarly appearance enhanced by wire-rimmed spectacles and the slight stoop that often marks those who spend their days bent over ancient texts. He greeted us with evident relief, his composure unable to entirely conceal the agitation that had clearly troubled him since the morning's revelations. "Mr. Holmes," he began, "this entire affair has left my household in considerable distress. Poor Constance was not merely an employee, but had become almost a member of the family during her months of service to my invalid sister." Holmes accepted the offered chair, but remained alert, his keen gaze cataloguing every detail of the room's appointments. "The circumstances of Miss Fairweather's final illness, you were present during those days?" "Indeed, though Dr. Whitfield insisted upon strict isolation once the fever manifested. Constance complained of headache and fatigue on the 13th. By evening, she was running a considerable temperature. Despite the doctor's best efforts, her condition deteriorated with alarming rapidity." "The symptoms suggested tropical fever?" I inquired, drawing upon my medical experience. Dr. Whitfield seemed to think so, though he confessed puzzlement at the severity. Constance had never travelled beyond England's shores, yet the presentation was consistent with exposure to some exotic pathogen. Pemberton's voice carried genuine sorrow. "She became delirious on the 14th, speaking of strange dreams and distant places, fragmentary references to Egypt and ancient burial chambers. Dr. Whitfield attributed it to the fever's effect upon her mind." Holmes leaned forward with evident interest. "Egypt, you say? I understand you are an antiquarian, Mr. Pemberton. Does your collection include Egyptian artifacts?" "I have recently acquired several pieces from excavations near Luxor, nothing of tremendous value, but items of considerable historical interest." Pemberton paused, uncertainty crossing his features. "You cannot suggest there is some connection?" "I suggest nothing at present," Holmes replied smoothly. "However, I should very much like to examine Miss Fairweather's quarters, if you would permit." The chamber we were shown was modest and orderly, yet Holmes's examination revealed details that had escaped casual observation. Kneeling beside a pair of ladies' boots, he touched the leather and brought his finger to his tongue. "Salt," he murmured. At the washstand, he noted a laudanum bottle bearing Dr. Whitfield's label, beside which stood a smaller phial whose paper had been abraded away. Upon the mantel, a small shell cameo yielded a faint granular dust when disturbed river silt, Holmes observed with satisfaction, as we prepared to depart. Holmes paused at the study door. "Our next destination, I believe, must be Kensal Green itself. The cemetery may yet yield answers that the drawing room cannot provide." The journey to Kensal Green Cemetery required us to traverse London's increasingly treacherous streets, where the fog had thickened to such density that our driver was compelled to proceed at little more than walking pace. Holmes utilized this enforced delay to elaborate upon his preliminary observations, his manner suggesting he was organizing the scattered pieces of evidence into a coherent pattern. The presence of river silt in Miss Fairweather's chamber, combined with the salt traces upon her footwear and the abraded laudanum phial, begins to paint a picture of activities extending well beyond the confines of an invalid's sick room, he remarked, as our cab navigated the obscured thoroughfares. The cemetery gates loomed before us through the murk like sentinels guarding the secrets of the dead. The groundskeeper who met us, the same weathered man named Hutchins, whose intimate knowledge of every grave under his care was evident from his first words, conducted us along the winding paths toward the Fairweather plot with the reverent care appropriate to his calling. "Never seen the like of it in 30 years tending these grounds," Hutchins confided as we approached the disturbed grave site. The coffin was proper sealed when we lowered it, witnessed by all present. Yet when we opened her up yesterday morning, nothing but weighted materials arranged to fool the casual observer. Holmes immediately began his systematic examination, kneeling beside the rectangular depression with the methodical precision of a natural philosopher. His fingers traced the earth's surface with delicate care, occasionally bringing samples to his nose or touching them to his tongue. The soil composition reveals this grave was disturbed not once, but twice, he announced after several minutes of careful study. Note the distinct layers, the original excavation, a subsequent disturbance occurring approximately 24 hours after the funeral, and finally yesterday's official exhumation. The earth itself told its story to Holmes's trained eye. Patches of unusual clay bearing a faint metallic odor that spoke of iron filings, and a peculiar compactness near the grave's foot that suggested heavy materials had been positioned there. Descending into the excavated grave with cat-like ease, Holmes examined the recovered materials with intense concentration. The coffin screws, hastily driven and bearing traces of Stockholm tar, told of hurried work performed by someone familiar with maritime materials. From a splinter of the coffin lid, he coaxed a flat blue fiber, stiff with pitch, which he folded carefully into his notebook. The ballast materials proved equally revealing, bricks with clotted mortar and iron bars whose battered ends retained faint letters. Wetting his finger, Holmes traced the markings. WK, he read, or reversed. K. W. Riverstock, I should think. Hutchins nodded with recognition. I've seen the like near the wharves below London Bridge. Boats take them as counterweights for their cargo. In a corner of the coffin lay a wad of old garments, damp and sour with the unmistakable smell of the Thames. Holmes lifted the bundle and examined it closely. Sailcloth, recut as lining. Our sham body was dressed from wharf materials. Rising from the grave, Holmes stood in contemplative silence, the fog beading upon his coat as he organized his observations. Observe the pattern, Watson. Salt upon boots in Belgravia, silt upon trinkets, tar upon screws, and river ballast for weight. Every thread leads us inexorably toward the water. He turned to Lestrade with that expression of quiet satisfaction that marked a significant breakthrough. There was no substitution here, Inspector. There never was a body in this coffin. The sealed casket satisfied the doctor's requirements for infectious disease precautions while concealing the deception from all observers. Then, where was Miss Fairweather during those crucial days? Lestrade demanded, consulting his notebook with growing frustration. Kept alive elsewhere, I believe, until her usefulness ended and she met her fate in the Thames. The laudanum in her chamber, the abraded file, the references to Egypt in her delirium all suggest she was drugged and held captive, possibly in some riverside location connected to Mr. Pemberton's antiquarian interests. Holmes paused, examining a barely visible indentation in the ground near the grave's perimeter. And this elongated depression, too narrow for a man's boot, but consistent with something being dragged rather than carried, suggests our perpetrators worked with considerable care to avoid detection. As we prepared to leave the cemetery, Holmes's demeanor indicated that the investigation had reached a crucial juncture. The evidence points unmistakably toward the river. Gentlemen, we must now trace these materials to their source, the wharves and warehouses, where a young woman might be concealed, and where those with knowledge of both antiquities and maritime practices might conduct their dark business. The undertaker's records will provide our next thread, but I suspect we shall find ourselves among the timber yards and boat sheds before this day concludes. The undertaker's establishment in Whitechapel occupied a narrow building whose black-painted facade and discreet brass nameplate proclaimed the professional dignity of Mr. Josiah Blackwood's calling. The interior maintained that hushed reverence appropriate to the business of death, with polished oak furnishings and the faint, sweet scent of preserving chemicals mingling with beeswax and lilies. Mr. Blackwood himself, a man whose pallid complexion and perpetually mournful expression seemed cultivated for his profession, received us with the careful courtesy reserved for official inquiries. Holmes wasted no time with pleasantries, producing the pitch-stiffened fibre recovered from Kensal Green and placing it upon Blackwood's mahogany desk. "This material was found upon Miss Fairweather's coffin screws. Is it consistent with your usual practices?" The undertaker examined the specimen with obvious perplexity, his weathered fingers testing its texture with professional familiarity. "Certainly not, Mr. Holmes. This is Stockholm tar, the coarse variety used by shipwrights and caulkers. My establishment employs only traditional beeswax compounds for sealing, applied according to methods passed down through generations of funeral craft." The implications struck me immediately, though Holmes had clearly anticipated this revelation. "Then you did not personally seal Miss Fairweather's coffin?" Blackwood's discomfort became palpable as he consulted his leather-bound ledger with evident reluctance. "The circumstances surrounding that particular interment were most irregular, gentlemen. Dr. Whitfield insisted upon extraordinary precautions due to the infectious nature of the deceased's illness, specifically requesting that the casket remain sealed throughout and that no viewing be permitted under any circumstances." Holmes leaned forward with that expression of keen interest which marked a significant development. "You never saw Miss Fairweather's remains?" The undertaker shook his head with obvious unease. "Never, Dr. Watson. The coffin was delivered to my premises already, sealed, bearing both Dr. Whitfield's medical certification and explicit instructions that it not be opened under any circumstances. My role was limited to providing the hearse and conducting the ceremony itself, with the sealed casket transported directly from the Pemberton residence to Kensal Green." This revelation transformed our understanding of the case entirely. Holmes immediately began questioning Blackwood about the coffin's construction, learning that it had been supplied by an obscure firm near the docks rather than crafted in Blackwood's own workshop. "The weight struck my bearers as unusual," Blackwood admitted when pressed. "Considerably heavier than one might expect for a young woman of slight build, though we attributed this to the lead-lining doctor Whitfield had specified for sanitary purposes." Armed with this intelligence, we departed for the Thames, where Holmes's deductions had consistently pointed throughout our investigation. The fog that shrouded London showed no signs of lifting, creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight that seemed to mirror the dark nature of our discoveries. The transition from Whitechapel's narrow streets to the bustling chaos of the riverside was jarring, the air thick with coal smoke, brine, and the countless odors of maritime commerce. Holmes moved through the maze of warehouses and wharves with purposeful determination, his keen eyes cataloguing every detail of the working waterfront. Near a cluster of timber yards, he paused to examine a pile of ballast bricks, several bearing the faint markings WK that matched those found in the false grave. An elderly caulker working nearby confirmed that such materials were commonly borrowed by small boat builders and coffin makers seeking inexpensive construction materials. The man's weathered features showed recognition when Holmes described our inquiry. "Aye, there was a young fellow here, perhaps 2 weeks past, wanting elm planks and a quantity of pitch for what he called a special consignment. Paid in cash and asked no questions, which suited me well enough. Had a distinctive scar below his right ear, like an old burn, and favored his left leg as though recently injured." Holmes's satisfaction was evident as another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Following the caulker's directions, we made our way to a warehouse district where legitimate commerce mingled with enterprises of more questionable character. Here, among buildings whose shuttered windows and reinforced doors suggested the need for both security and discretion, Holmes paused before a structure bearing traces of recent activity, despite its apparently abandoned appearance. A riverman named Tobias Marsh, whose intimate knowledge of Thames traffic was evident from his first words, confirmed our suspicions. "That building there has seen unusual visitors these past weeks, gentlemen in fine clothes conducting business with types you wouldn't normally expect in such company. crates with Egyptian markings, moved always under cover of darkness, and premium rates paid for storage space with no questions asked. Holmes studied the warehouse with evident satisfaction, his manner indicating that the investigation had reached a crucial juncture. "The pattern becomes clear, Watson. We have a young woman who was never properly buried, an undertaker who never saw her remains, and a network of riverside accomplices skilled in both maritime practices and the antiquities trade. The threads converge upon this very district, where Miss Fairweather met her true fate." The warehouse that had drawn Holmes's attention stood with deliberate anonymity among its commercial neighbors, its weathered facade bearing traces of hastily obscured signage that suggested recent efforts to conceal its true purpose. Unlike the bustling activity surrounding legitimate enterprises, this building maintained an air of calculated abandonment that immediately aroused suspicion in my friend's trained eye. Holmes approached with characteristic methodical precision, his keen gaze cataloging every detail while maintaining the casual demeanor of gentlemen taking riverside air during their investigation. The muddy approach before the main entrance revealed telltale signs of recent heavy traffic, despite the building's supposedly vacant state. Deep ruts suggested loaded carts had passed frequently, while scattered fragments of rope and packing straw indicated cargo handling operations conducted with considerable care to avoid detection. Holmes knelt to examine a distinctive wheel impression, his fingers tracing the pattern with scientific accuracy. "A specialized conveyance, Watson, designed for transporting delicate antiquities. Note the unusual breadth of the tire and the careful spacing characteristics of vehicles employed by museum collectors and dealers in rare artifacts." Moving along the building's perimeter, Holmes discovered a side entrance partially concealed by stacked timber, its lock bearing fresh scratches that suggested recent and frequent use. The door itself, though appearing weathered from casual observation, revealed upon closer inspection that its hinges had been recently oiled and its frame reinforced with iron brackets of distinctly modern manufacture. "Professional work," Holmes murmured, running his fingers along the metal reinforcements. "Someone has invested considerable effort in making this entrance both secure and easily accessible to authorized persons." Lestrade, whose patience with Holmes's methodical approach occasionally wore thin during active investigations, nevertheless produced his warrant and obtained a crowbar from a neighboring yard. The reluctant lock yielded with harsh complaint, revealing an interior thick with the mingled odors of salt, camphor, and pine tar. A narrow skylight cast sickly illumination upon stacked crates, whose stenciled hieroglyphic markings spoke unmistakably of Egyptian origins, confirming our growing suspicions about the antiquarian connection to Miss Fairweather's fate. Holmes moved immediately to a discolored patch of floorboards at the warehouse center, where twin scars from screw jacks and the oval impression of a lead lining told their silent story. "Here was your special consignment," he announced, lifting a minute fiber that matched the tarred material recovered from Kensal Green. Sawdust, mixed with pitch flakes, scattered the area, while a faint track of scuff marks led directly toward the river door, beside which lay strips of sailcloth bearing a long, pale brown hair caught where knots had been furiously tied. Our investigation was interrupted by the approach of a dock worker whose furtive manner suggested information for sale rather than casual conversation. The man, whose scarred hands and tar-stained clothing marked him as genuine laborer, glanced nervously about before speaking in lowered tones. "You gentlemen asking questions about the warehouse? There's been strange doings these past weeks, and some of us what work the docks have noticed things that don't sit right with honest folk." The worker, identifying himself as Samuel Briggs, proved remarkably observant despite his humble station. He had witnessed the nighttime arrival of Egyptian crates, always accompanied by gentlemen whose fine clothing contrasted sharply with their rough hired assistants. More disturbing still, he had observed the transport of what appeared to be a human form, wrapped in canvas yet handled with careful attention, usually reserved for valuable cargo rather than deceased persons. "The young lady," if lady she was, seemed to move of her own accord when they carried her from the carriage. Briggs confided with evident unease. Not like any corpse I've seen, though she appeared drugged or senseless. They took her inside through that side door, and we heard sounds from within for several days, voices, footsteps, and occasionally what might have been crying or calling out. Holmes's expression grew increasingly grave as Briggs continued his account. The timeline aligned perfectly with the period between Miss Fairweather's supposed death and her discovery in the Thames. The warehouse had clearly served as a temporary prison where the young woman had been held captive while her elaborate funeral proceeded according to plan. "We are dealing with a conspiracy of considerable sophistication," Holmes observed as we prepared to delve deeper into the warehouse mysteries. Miss Fairweather was kept alive for a specific purpose, then eliminated when her usefulness ended. The Egyptian connection suggests motives far beyond simple murder. Further exploration of the warehouse interior revealed a complexity of purpose that extended far beyond simple storage, as Holmes's methodical examination uncovered layer upon layer of carefully concealed criminal enterprise. The main floor, despite its apparent abandonment, showed signs of systematic organization, with Egyptian crates arranged according to some internal logic that spoke of professional handling rather than random accumulation. Holmes moved through this maze of antiquities with characteristic precision, his trained eye cataloguing every detail while maintaining that air of casual observation that masked his intense concentration. A narrow staircase, partially concealed behind stacked timber, led to an upper chamber that had been converted into a sophisticated workspace. Here, the medicinal odors noted earlier intensified, mingling with the distinctive scents of various chemical preservatives and the musty aroma of ancient papyrus. Holmes immediately recognized the apparatus arranged upon sturdy tables as belonging to a document authentication laboratory, complete with delicate measuring instruments, specialized brushes, and glass vessels containing solutions whose purposes were unmistakably connected to the restoration and analysis of ancient materials. The centerpiece of this clandestine operation proved to be a leather-bound journal whose pages revealed the true scope of the conspiracy that had cost Miss Fairweather her life. Holmes examined the handwriting with his magnifying glass, noting the deliberate alterations intended to disguise the author's identity, yet the content spoke clearly of a systematic program of antiquities forgery and authentication fraud. References to the Fairweather girl's unique qualifications appeared throughout, alongside technical notes about hieroglyphic translation and papyrus restoration that confirmed our growing understanding of her specialized role in the operation. "Observe, Watson," Holmes remarked, indicating entries that detailed specific transactions. Miss Fairweather was not merely a victim of circumstance, but was deliberately recruited for her scholarly expertise. Her employment with Mr. Pemberton provided perfect cover for accessing legitimate antiquarian circles while developing the knowledge necessary for sophisticated forgery work. Adjacent to the main laboratory, Holmes discovered a smaller chamber whose purpose became immediately apparent from the iron rings bolted to the floor and the basic furnishings that spoke of prolonged human occupancy. A narrow cot bore the impression of recent use, while a writing desk positioned beneath the single small window contained scattered sheets of papyrus bearing Miss Fairweather's distinctive handwriting. The evidence of coerced scholarly work was unmistakable translations of hieroglyphic texts, authentication certificates bearing forged museum seals, and detailed provenance documents that would have lent credibility to stolen or fabricated antiquities. Most disturbing of all was a small diary, clearly Miss Fairweather's personal record of her captivity, whose entries revealed the gradual escalation from voluntary scholarly assistance to forced participation in criminal fraud. The final entries, dated just days before her supposed death, showed increasing resistance to her captor's demands and growing awareness of the illegal nature of her work. They speak of ancient rituals and sacred knowledge. One entry read, "But I begin to understand that their true interest lies in the substantial sums paid by European collectors for properly documented Egyptian treasures." Holmes's examination of the chemical apparatus revealed traces of chloral hydrate and laudanum, confirming that Miss Fairweather had been kept in a state of drugged compliance when persuasion proved insufficient. The sophistication of the operation impressed even my friend's experienced eye. This was no simple grave-robbing scheme, but an international network of antiquities trafficking that required both scholarly expertise and considerable financial backing. Our investigation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps from the warehouse entrance below, causing Holmes to extinguish our lamp and motion for complete silence. Through gaps in the wooden partition, we observed a figure entering with evident familiarity, his movements suggesting intimate knowledge of the premises. The man, whose scarred features and distinctive limp immediately identified him as the elm and pitch purchaser described by our Colker informant, began checking various concealment points with the systematic thoroughness of one responsible for maintaining the facility's security. Holmes's swift action in apprehending this individual, who identified himself as Ned Tolliver when Lestrade's questioning loosened his tongue, provided the crucial link we had been seeking between the warehouse operation and the medical professionals who had orchestrated Miss Fairweather's elaborate funeral charade. Tolliver's reluctant admissions confirmed that Dr. Whitfield had visited the warehouse regularly, bringing medical supplies and adjusting the dosages that kept their captive in a manageable state of semi-consciousness. The doctor said it were necessary for her condition, Tolliver explained under Lestrade's persistent questioning, that she needed special care, what couldn't be provided in a regular hospital. Paid me well to keep watch and make sure she took her medicines proper-like. The revelation that Dr. Whitfield had been directly involved in maintaining Miss Fairweather's captivity transformed our understanding of the case entirely. This was not merely a matter of a physician being deceived by clever criminals, but of medical authority being deliberately employed to facilitate kidnapping and murder. The elaborate funeral, with its sealed coffin and infectious disease precautions, had been designed not to protect public health, but to prevent any examination that might reveal the deception. Holmes's satisfaction with these discoveries was evident as he examined the final piece of documentary evidence, shipping manifests that revealed regular consignments of authenticated Egyptian antiquities departing London for private collections throughout Europe. The financial rewards were substantial, with individual pieces commanding thousands of pounds when properly documented by someone with Miss Fairweather's legitimate scholarly credentials. The pattern becomes clear, Holmes observed, as we prepared to confront Dr. Whitfield with our evidence. Miss Fairweather's knowledge made her invaluable for creating believable authentication documents, but her conscience made her increasingly dangerous as she recognized the criminal nature of the enterprise. The elaborate burial charade provided perfect cover for her elimination while maintaining the fiction of natural death. The warehouse had yielded its secrets, revealing a conspiracy that reached into the highest circles of European antiquities, collecting and employed the most respectable members of London's medical and scholarly communities. As we departed through the fog-shrouded streets toward our confrontation with Dr. Whitfield, I could not help but reflect that Miss Fairweather had indeed been buried twice, once in the elaborate charade designed to conceal her murder, and once in the dark waters of the Thames when her usefulness to her captors had finally ended. The journey from the Riverside warehouse to Dr. Marcus Whitfield's residence in Harley Street provided a stark study in contrasts. As our hansom cab carried us from the grimy world of criminal enterprise into the refined atmosphere of London's most prestigious medical district, the persistent November fog seemed to follow us through the transition, wrapping the elegant Georgian townhouses in the same grey shroud that had concealed the warehouse's dark secrets. Yet the change in surroundings was unmistakable. Here, brass nameplates gleamed despite the murky air, while well-maintained steps and polished door knockers spoke of professional success built upon years of careful cultivation of reputation and respectability. Holmes remained absorbed in contemplation throughout our journey, his keen mind undoubtedly organizing the wealth of evidence we had accumulated into a coherent pattern that would expose Dr. Whitfield's role in the conspiracy, the chloral hydrate residue, the warehouse laboratory, Miss Fairweather's diary entries, and Tolliver's reluctant admissions had woven together into a tapestry of deception that implicated the physician far beyond mere professional negligence. As our cab drew to a halt before the doctor's imposing residence, Holmes's manner suggested he anticipated more than a routine medical consultation. The housekeeper who admitted us, a stern woman whose suspicious glances suggested she had been instructed to screen visitors carefully, initially attempted to turn us away with claims that the doctor was attending urgent cases throughout the city. However, Lestrade's warrant and Holmes's quietly insistent manner soon secured our admission to the waiting room, where the familiar odors of carbolic acid and medicinal preparations mingled with the leather and mahogany scents of professional prosperity. The walls displayed certificates of medical excellence and anatomical engravings, all designed to inspire confidence in Dr. Whitfield's scholarly credentials and professional competence. Dr. Whitfield's eventual appearance revealed a man whose outward composure barely concealed underlying tension, his pale features and slightly trembling hands suggesting the strain of maintaining deception under increasingly difficult circumstances. His greeting was cordial yet guarded, the practiced bedside manner of a physician accustomed to managing difficult situations while protecting sensitive information about his patient's conditions. "Gentlemen," he began with studied casualness, "I trust this visit concerns some routine matter of medical testimony rather than any urgent crisis requiring my immediate attention." Holmes's response was characteristically methodical, producing the pitch-stiffened fiber recovered from Kensal Green and placing it upon the doctor's mahogany desk with deliberate precision. "This material was found upon Miss Fairweather's coffin screws, Doctor. Stockholm tar, the coarse variety used by shipwrights rather than the traditional beeswax compounds employed by respectable undertakers. I believe you will find it illuminating." Whitfield examined the specimen with obvious discomfort, his weathered fingers testing its texture while his professional facade began to show signs of strain. The circumstances surrounding Miss Fairweather's interment were most irregular, Holmes continued, his voice maintaining that deceptively conversational tone that marked his most effective interrogations. "You insisted upon extraordinary precautions due to the infectious nature of her illness, specifically requesting that the casket remain sealed throughout and that no viewing be permitted under any circumstances. Yet, when we examined the undertaker's records, we discovered that he never saw Miss Fairweather's remains, receiving instead a coffin already sealed and bearing your explicit instructions that it not be opened." The color began to drain from Whitfield's face as Holmes systematically dismantled his carefully constructed deception. "The weight struck the bearers as unusual," Holmes observed, "considerably heavier than one might expect for a young woman of slight build, though they attributed this to the lead lining you had specified for sanitary purposes. In reality, the coffin contained ballast materials, bricks bearing the mark, WK, iron bars, and sailcloth arranged to fool casual observation." Lestrade stepped forward, producing the small vial containing evidence recovered from the warehouse. "We have also discovered the facility where Miss Fairweather was actually held captive, Doctor. A sophisticated operation involving antiquities forgery, complete with chemical apparatus and restraining devices. The young woman's diary, found at the scene, details her forced participation in document authentication and her growing resistance to her captor's demands." Whitfield's stammered protests grew increasingly desperate as Holmes presented each piece of evidence with inexorable logic. "The chloral hydrate and laudanum, found in quantities sufficient to maintain drugged compliance, the specialized knowledge required to keep a captive in manageable condition, the medical authority necessary to orchestrate such an elaborate funeral charade, all point to professional involvement far beyond mere deception about cause of death." "You visited the warehouse regularly," Holmes continued, his gray eyes never leaving the doctor's increasingly agitated features. "Bringing medical supplies, adjusting dosages, ensuring that Miss Fairweather remained useful to her captors while appearing to the world to have died of natural causes." The elaborate funeral provided perfect cover for her continued captivity, with the sealed coffin preventing any examination that might reveal the scene. Deception. Dr. Whitfield sank into his chair, his earlier composure utterly shattered as the full scope of his complicity became undeniable. "It was not intended to end in murder," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the fog-muffled sounds of the street outside. "The arrangement was temporary, a matter of scholarly consultation that would benefit all parties involved. Miss Fairweather's expertise was invaluable for certain authentication work, and substantial compensation was offered for her cooperation." Holmes leaned forward with that expression of keen interest that marked a significant breakthrough. Yet cooperation became coercion when her conscience proved inconvenient. The diary entries reveal her growing awareness of the criminal nature of the enterprise and her attempts to withdraw from participation. "At what point, Doctor, did temporary consultation become permanent captivity?" The physician's hands shook as he reached for a decanter of brandy, his professional dignity crumbling under the weight of accumulated evidence. There were others involved, gentlemen, individuals whose interests extended far beyond simple antiquities trading. International collectors, museum officials, scholars, whose reputations depended upon the authenticity of their acquisitions. Miss Fairweather's refusal to continue her work threatened to expose a network worth hundreds of thousands of pounds. As Dr. Whitfield's partial confession revealed the broader scope of the conspiracy, Holmes's satisfaction was tempered by the recognition that we had uncovered only the beginning of a criminal enterprise whose tentacles reached into the highest circles of European scholarship and collecting. The case of the girl who was buried twice was proving to be merely the visible surface of a corruption that extended far beyond a single physician's greed, promising revelations that would shake the very foundations of the antiquarian world. Dr. Whitfield's confession continued with increasing desperation, his earlier composure entirely shattered as he detailed the network of corruption that had ensnared him. "The arrangement began innocently enough," he stammered, reaching again for his brandy decanter with trembling hands. "Mr. Pemberton approached me with what seemed a legitimate scholarly consultation. Miss Fairweather required medical supervision during her work with certain ancient materials. Some artifacts, he claimed, carried residual toxins from their burial environments that might affect her health during prolonged exposure." Holmes's grey eyes never left the physician's face, as Whitfield described how this innocent medical oversight had gradually evolved into something far more sinister. Pemberton's requests had become increasingly specific. Medications to enhance concentration during long translation sessions, then stronger compounds to ensure Miss Fairweather's compliance. When her conscience began to trouble her about the authenticity of certain documents she was being asked to produce, he assured me that her work was essential to preventing valuable artifacts from falling into the hands of unscrupulous dealers, Whitfield continued, his voice growing weaker with each admission. The transformation from medical consultant to active conspirator had occurred so gradually that Whitfield claimed he had not recognized the criminal nature of his involvement until Miss Fairweather's attempts to withdraw from the operation had necessitated more drastic measures. "She discovered discrepancies in the provenance documents," he explained, began questioning the legitimacy of artifacts that bore no resemblance to pieces from established excavations. When she threatened to contact the British Museum's Authentication Committee, Mr. Pemberton insisted that more decisive action was required. Holmes leaned forward with that expression of intense concentration that marked crucial moments in his investigations. "The decision to stage her death, this was Pemberton's suggestion?" Whitfield nodded miserably, lifting the brandy glass toward his lips before pausing with sudden alarm. "The color," he whispered, staring at the amber liquid with growing horror. "It should not have that particular hue." The glass fell from his nerveless fingers, shattering upon the turkey carpet as he clutched at his throat with a strangled cry. I was at his side immediately, forcing open his collar while the unmistakable bitter almond scent rose from the spilled brandy. "Prussic acid," I announced grimly. feeling for a pulse that fluttered weakly beneath my fingers. Holmes had already moved to the sideboard, examining the decanter with his magnifying glass while maintaining careful distance from the contaminated vessel. "Applied recently," he observed, noting the viscous residue upon the stopper's ground glass surface, a single droplet designed to dissolve gradually into the brandy, ensuring that only one drink would prove fatal. Lestrade immediately summoned assistance while Holmes began his systematic examination of the study, searching for evidence of the poisoner's identity and method of access. Upon the mantelpiece, he discovered the ash of Egyptian cigarettes, their distinctive pale color and faint attar scent entirely foreign to Whitfield's austere habits. A hastily discarded blotting pad revealed the ghostly impression of angular handwriting. "Remove the evidence." The message bore the initials A.P., followed by a distinctive flourish that matched samples of Pemberton's correspondence found among Whitfield's papers. The housekeeper's frightened testimony confirmed that a gentleman caller had visited during the afternoon, presenting credentials that had secured him private access to the study while she was dismissed to the kitchen. "He spoke like a learned man," she reported, with the careful pronunciation of one accustomed to lecturing, and he carried a walking stick with an unusual carved head that clicked distinctively upon the floor. Holmes's satisfaction with these discoveries was evident as he sealed the contaminated decanter and gathered samples of the foreign ash for later analysis. "Our adversary has revealed himself through his very attempt at concealment," he announced, his manner indicating that the investigation had reached its decisive phase. The poisoning of Dr. Whitfield was intended to silence the one witness who could directly implicate Mr. Pemberton in Miss Fairweather's murder, yet the method employed provides us with evidence more damning than any confession. As we prepared to depart, Holmes's strategic mind was already organizing the final confrontation. The message indicates a rendezvous at 9 o'clock, presumably to destroy remaining evidence at the Riverside warehouse. We shall provide Mr. Pemberton with the opportunity to complete his work under circumstances of our own choosing. The fog that shrouded London seemed to thicken with approaching darkness, creating an atmosphere perfectly suited to the dangerous game that lay ahead. The evening mist that had plagued London throughout our investigation now served as our ally, transforming the warehouse district into a labyrinth of shadows and muffled sounds that would conceal our movements while exposing those of our quarry. Holmes had spent the intervening hours in meticulous preparation, his strategic mind organizing every element of the confrontation that would bring Mr. Aldrich Pemberton's criminal enterprise to its inevitable conclusion. The fog rolled off the Thames in thick banks, reducing visibility to mere yards, while lending the entire scene an otherworldly quality that seemed appropriate to the dark revelations we had uncovered. Our surveillance positions were established with military precision, each man placed according to Holmes's careful analysis of the warehouse's approaches and potential escape routes. Lestrade positioned his constables at strategic points throughout the district, their orders to remain concealed until the predetermined signal indicated the moment for coordinated action. I took my place within the skeletal remains of a derelict counting house adjacent to the main building, its crumbling walls providing excellent concealment, while offering clear sightlines to both the river entrance and the thoroughfare that Pemberton would likely use for his approach. Holmes himself had undertaken one of his remarkable transformations, employing grease paint, a tarred neckerchief, and carefully applied theatrical techniques to assume the appearance of Ned Tolliver, the warehouse keeper whose cooperation we had secured earlier. The disguise was masterful in its attention to detail, from the distinctive limp created by binding his ankle to the sawdust deliberately applied to his clothing to suggest recent manual labor. Our adversary expects to find Tolliver maintaining his usual watch, Holmes explained as he completed his preparations, and we shall provide him with exactly that expectation until the moment arrives to reveal the deception. The hours of waiting passed with that peculiar mixture of tedium and intense anticipation that marks such operations. Every sound, from the fog-shrouded streets potentially signaling our quarry's approach. The distant chimes of various church bells marked the passage of time, while the steady lap of Thames water against the pilings provided a rhythmic counterpoint to our vigilant silence. Holmes remained motionless at his post within the warehouse, positioned near the spot where the screwjacks had scarred the floorboards during Miss Fairweather's captivity. A small bundle of documents arranged before him to suggest recent activity. As the 9th hour approached, the fog seemed to thicken with almost supernatural timing, reducing the world to a series of vague shapes and muffled sounds that heightened every sense to painful acuity. The first indication of time's deceit beloved. Pemberton's arrival came as the low thrum of oars cutting through water, followed by the gentle bump of a small craft against the river steps. Through the murk, a hooded lantern flashed 3 measured signals, answered by Holmes's grunt of acknowledgement in Tolliver's rough accent, establishing the expected communication pattern while maintaining the deception. Pemberton's approach revealed a man operating under considerable psychological strain, his usually composed scholarly demeanor betrayed by nervous glances over his shoulder and the trembling of hands that fumbled slightly with the warehouse lock. The distinctive click of his ornate walking stick upon the wooden steps confirmed his identity beyond doubt, while the careful way he moved through the entrance suggested intimate familiarity with the premises. Behind him followed a second figure, clearly one of the rivermen whose services he had employed for the more unsavory aspects of his enterprise, burdened with a narrow chest that undoubtedly contained materials for destroying evidence. "The papers, first." Pemberton's voice carried clearly through the warehouse's acoustic properties, his cultured tones contrasting sharply with the rough environment as he addressed what he believed to be Tolliver. "Dr. Whitfield's unfortunate demise has necessitated certain precautionary measures, and we cannot afford to leave any documentary evidence that might connect our scholarly endeavors to recent unfortunate events." The casual reference to murder as mere inconvenience revealed the true depths of his moral corruption, confirming that we were dealing with a man for whom human life had become subordinate to financial gain and reputation preservation. Holmes maintained his disguise until Pemberton had fully committed himself to the destruction of evidence, allowing the antiquarian to reveal both his methods and his complete disregard for the lives he had destroyed. Only when Pemberton began systematically burning documents in a metal brazier did Holmes give the predetermined signal, a sharp whistle that brought Lestrade's constables converging from their concealed positions while he threw off his disguise with dramatic flourish. "Mr. Aldrich Pemberton," Holmes announced with that tone of quiet authority that brooked no resistance, "you are under arrest for the murder of Miss Constance Fairweather and the attempted murder of Dr. Marcus Whitfield." The transformation from scholarly gentleman to trapped criminal was instantaneous and complete, Pemberton's cultivated facade crumbling as he recognized that his elaborate deceptions had finally been exposed. The walking stick fell from nerveless fingers, revealing upon closer examination a hollow compartment within its carved head that had concealed the vial of prussic acid used to poison Whitfield's brandy. The evidence recovered from the warehouse that night provided the final links in the chain of proof that would ensure Pemberton's conviction. The narrow chest contained not only forged authentication documents bearing Miss Fairweather's forced handwriting, but also a collection of genuine artifacts whose provenance had been deliberately obscured to facilitate their sale to private collectors throughout Europe. Most damning of all was a leather portfolio containing correspondence with museum officials and wealthy collectors, revealing the international scope of the antiquities fraud network that had motivated Miss Fairweather's kidnapping and ultimate murder. As Lestrade's men secured the prisoners and began cataloguing the recovered evidence, Holmes examined the final piece of physical proof that would connect Pemberton directly to both crime scenes. Upon the sole of the antiquarian's boot, barely visible but unmistakable to Holmes's trained eye, were traces of the distinctive Stockholm tar and iron filings that had marked his presence at both Kensal Green Cemetery and Dr. Whitfield's study. The same material that sealed Miss Fairweather's false coffin and contaminated the brandy decanter, Holmes observed with satisfaction. providing an unbroken chain of evidence from the warehouse to both scenes of your criminal activity. The fog that had concealed our operation began to lift as dawn approached, revealing the full scope of the conspiracy that had cost 2 lives and threatened to corrupt the very foundations of scholarly integrity. Pemberton's final words before being led away revealed the arrogance that had ultimately led to his downfall. "You cannot comprehend the value of what you have destroyed, Mr. Holmes. The artifacts I provided to collectors represented knowledge that would otherwise have been lost to bureaucratic museum policies and academic jealousy. It was the complaint of a man who had convinced himself that murder was justified by intellectual superiority, a delusion that would provide cold comfort during the years of imprisonment that awaited him. The pale November dawn that broke over the Thames brought with it a clarity that extended far beyond the gradual lifting of London's persistent fog, as the final threads of Mr. Aldrich Pemberton's elaborate deception were drawn together in the cold light of justice. The warehouse district, which had concealed such dark secrets beneath its mundane commercial facade, now buzzed with the methodical activity of Lestrade's constables as they catalogued evidence and secured the premises that had served as both prison and forgery workshop for the unfortunate Miss Constance Fairweather. Holmes remained at the scene long after Pemberton and his accomplices had been led away in chains, his keen eyes making one final survey of the crime scene with that systematic precision that never failed to extract every possible detail from the physical evidence. The scarred floorboards where the screwjacks had positioned the false coffin, the chemical apparatus that had maintained Miss Fairweather's drugged compliance, the river door, through which her weighted body had made its final journey. Each element spoke to my friend's trained perception with the clarity of written testimony. "Observe, Watson," Holmes remarked as we prepared to depart, indicating the distinctive impressions left by Pemberton's ornate walking stick upon the warehouse floor. Even in his final desperate attempt to destroy evidence, our antiquarian could not resist the theatrical gesture. The very implement that concealed his poison became the signature of his presence at every crucial moment of this conspiracy. The journey back to Baker Street provided welcome respite from the grim atmosphere of the Riverside district. Though Holmes remained absorbed in contemplation throughout our passage through the awakening city, the familiar comfort of our lodgings, with Mrs. Hudson's excellent breakfast awaiting, and the morning papers already arranged upon the table, offered a stark contrast to the sordid criminal enterprise we had just dismantled. Yet I could see in my friend's expression that the intellectual satisfaction of solving the puzzle was tempered by genuine sorrow for the victim whose brilliant mind had been so cruelly exploited. "The deception began," Holmes explained as he settled into his favorite chair, "the moment Dr. Whitfield allowed his professional authority to be harnessed to Pemberton's scheme. Consider the sequence of events. Miss Fairweather falls ill with what appears to be a virulent fever. Yet no examination of the patient occurs after the initial diagnosis. The symptoms, delirium, references to Egypt, rapid deterioration, were induced through careful administration of chloral hydrate and laudanum, creating the perfect medical justification for isolation and a sealed coffin. I consulted my notes from the investigation, marveling at how each seemingly disparate clue had contributed to the final revelation. The physical evidence told the true story at every stage. The salt upon her boots in Belgravia, the river silt upon her personal effects, the Stockholm tar upon the coffin screws, all pointed inexorably toward the Thames and the warehouse where she was actually held captive. "Precisely, Watson." The grave at Kensal Green revealed 3 distinct disturbances, not merely the burial and subsequent exhumation. The intermediate disturbance, occurring approximately 24 hours after the funeral, showed their anxiety when someone remarked upon the coffin's unusual weight. They returned to adjust the ballast materials, yet even this precaution could not conceal the fundamental deception from scientific examination. Holmes produced the hollow-headed walking stick that had concealed Pemberton's prussic acid, examining its ingenious construction with professional appreciation, despite his moral revulsion for its purpose. The attempted murder of Dr. Whitfield represented both the conspiracy's greatest weakness and its most revealing moment. Pemberton's Egyptian cigarettes in the physician's austere study, the distinctive impression of his walking stick upon the carpet, the blotting paper bearing his handwriting, each element proclaimed his guilt more clearly than any confession. The morning brought news from Lestrade that Dr. Whitfield, though gravely weakened by the poison's assault, would survive to provide crucial testimony against his former collaborator. The physician's recovery had revealed additional details about the international scope of the antiquities fraud, with correspondence indicating transactions involving museums and private collectors throughout Europe. The financial rewards had been enormous, yet the human cost had been calculated with chilling precision from the operation's inception. Miss Fairweather's expertise in ancient Egyptian languages made her invaluable for creating sophisticated authentication documents. Holmes continued, his voice carrying genuine sadness for the victim's fate. Her employment with Mr. Pemberton provided perfect cover for accessing legitimate scholarly circles while developing the specialized knowledge necessary for high-quality forgery work. When her conscience began to trouble her about the criminal nature of her activities, she became a liability that required permanent elimination. The examination of Miss Fairweather's recovered diary had revealed the gradual transformation from willing scholarly assistant to coerced prisoner, her final entries documenting desperate attempts to resist her captor's demands and growing awareness of the illegal nature of their enterprise. The defensive wounds upon her hands, discovered during the post-mortem examination, testified to her brave struggle against overwhelming odds in her final moments. As the days following Pemberton's arrest brought forth the full scope of his criminal network, the implications extended far beyond the immediate murders to threaten the very foundations of scholarly integrity in the antiquarian world. The British Museum initiated comprehensive reviews of recent acquisitions, while continental institutions began questioning the legitimacy of pieces that had entered their collections through Pemberton's network. 7 additional conspirators were arrested, from the rivermen who had disposed of Miss Fairweather's body to the warehouse workers who had maintained her captivity. The tragedy lies not merely in Miss Fairweather's death, Holmes reflected as we read the morning reports of the expanding investigation, but in the corruption of institutions that should have protected her scholarly integrity rather than exploiting her expertise for criminal gain. The fog that shrouded London throughout our investigation has finally lifted, yet the moral darkness revealed by this case will cast shadows over the antiquarian world for years to come. The evidence recovered from the warehouse would eventually lead to the recovery of dozens of stolen artifacts and exposure of fraudulent pieces that had been accepted by prestigious collections throughout Europe. Miss Fairweather's genuine scholarly contributions to Egyptological knowledge would be recognized posthumously. Her legitimate research distinguished from the coerced forgeries that had cost her life. Yet no amount of recovered treasure could adequately compensate for the human suffering that had been the true price of Pemberton's greed. In the end, Miss Constance Fairweather was indeed buried twice, once in the elaborate charade designed to conceal her kidnapping, and once with proper dignity, when her remains were finally laid to rest in consecrated ground. The case would serve as a model for future prosecutions involving complex international fraud, demonstrating the effectiveness of scientific detection methods applied to crimes of unprecedented sophistication. As Holmes observed in his final reflection upon the matter, truth, like the Thames itself, inevitably finds its course, carrying with it both the debris of human corruption and the promise of ultimate justice. The weeks following Mr. Aldrich Pemberton's arrest witnessed the systematic unraveling of a conspiracy whose tentacles reached far beyond the fog-shrouded warehouses of the Thames. The trial, conducted at the Old Bailey with all the solemn ceremony befitting such a momentous case, became the sensation of the season, drawing scholarly observers from across Europe who came to witness what the press had dubbed the Egyptian conspiracy. Holmes appeared as the Crown's principal witness, his methodical presentation of evidence transforming the courtroom into a lecture hall where each clue was examined with scientific precision and inexorable logic. The defendant's composure, which had served him so well during his years of scholarly deception, crumbled entirely under Holmes's relentless analysis. My friend began with the temporal impossibility that had first captured his attention, the waterman's estimate of Miss Fairweather's time in the Thames refusing to align with the date upon her mourning cards. "When time will not bend to accommodate deception," Holmes observed from the witness box, "the fabrication must reveal itself." From that moment, the sealed coffin became not a medical precaution, but a deliberate screen to conceal the absence of any corpse whatsoever. Each piece of physical evidence was then presented with devastating clarity, forming what Holmes characterized as syllables in a word that spelled river. The salt traces upon Miss Fairweather's boots in Belgravia, the river silt upon her personal effects, the Stockholm tar upon the coffin screws, the ballast bricks bearing the distinctive WK markings, all pointed inexorably away from any legitimate burial toward the Thames and the warehouse where the young woman had been held captive. The undertaker's testimony that he had never seen the deceased, receiving instead a pre-sealed coffin with explicit instructions against opening, demolished any remaining doubt about the deception's scope. The revelation that shocked even the seasoned court observers came during the examination of Pemberton's international correspondence, when the prosecution revealed the true extent of the network that had motivated the conspiracy. Museums in Berlin, Vienna, and Paris had unknowingly purchased forged artifacts bearing Miss Fairweather's coerced authentication, while private collectors throughout the continent had paid enormous sums for pieces whose provenance had been systematically obscured through document fraud. The financial rewards exceeded £50,000, transforming what might have appeared a crime of passion into a calculated commercial enterprise built upon scholarly corruption. Dr. Whitfield's testimony, delivered from a bath chair due to his continued weakness from the prussic acid's effects, provided the crucial insider's perspective on how medical authority had been systematically corrupted to facilitate kidnapping and murder. His account of the gradual transformation from innocent consultation to active complicity sent ripples of horror through the courtroom's learned audience, yet his genuine remorse could not mitigate the enormity of his participation in Miss Fairweather's captivity and ultimate death. Most damning of all were Miss Fairweather's own diary entries, read aloud in court with respectful solemnity. Her final weeks of captivity were documented with scholarly precision, recording not only the physical conditions of her imprisonment, but also her growing awareness of the criminal nature of the work she was being forced to perform. The entries revealed a brilliant mind, trapped by circumstance, yet refusing to surrender its moral integrity, even when such resistance inevitably led to her destruction. The jury's verdict required less than an hour's deliberation, their unanimous finding of guilty on all charges reflecting the overwhelming nature of the evidence presented. Pemberton received the death sentence, subsequently commuted to life imprisonment due to his age and previously unblemished reputation. His accomplices received varying terms of penal servitude, while Dr. Whitfield's cooperation with the authorities earned him a relatively lenient sentence of 7 years imprisonment, though his medical license was permanently revoked. As we returned to Baker Street following the verdict, Holmes reflected upon the case's broader implications with characteristic philosophical detachment. The familiar comfort of our lodgings, with Mrs. Hudson's excellent dinner awaiting and the evening papers already arranged upon the table, offered welcome respite from the grim atmosphere of legal proceedings. Yet I could see in my friend's expression that the intellectual satisfaction of solving the puzzle was tempered by genuine sorrow for the victim whose expertise had been so cruelly exploited. "The corruption of scholarship represents a peculiar form of murder, Watson," Holmes observed as he settled into his favorite chair, the firelight playing across his angular features. Miss Fairweather's death was tragic enough, yet the systematic perversion of academic integrity may prove the more lasting crime. Consider how many museum collections must now be subjected to rigorous re-examination, how many supposedly authenticated pieces will prove to be elaborate fabrications bearing her unwilling signature. The scandal had indeed reverberated through the academic world, prompting comprehensive reviews of authentication processes and stricter scrutiny of provenance in antiquities dealing. The British Museum initiated sweeping audits of recent acquisitions, while continental institutions began questioning the legitimacy of pieces that had entered their collections through Pemberton's network. Miss Fairweather, initially merely a victim in a sensational crime, was posthumously recognized for her legitimate scholarly contributions, her genuine research finally distinguished from the forgeries she had been compelled to create. "There are always men who would embalm a lie and sell it as a relic," Holmes remarked, reaching for his violin with that distant expression that indicated his mind was already turning toward future challenges. "Our task is merely to provide air and a measuring rod. The fog that shrouded London throughout our investigation has finally lifted, Watson, revealing the city in sharp relief beneath winter sunlight that promises better days ahead." As the evening settled around us, and Holmes began to coax a contemplative melody from his instrument, I reflected that the case of the girl who was buried twice had indeed reached its proper conclusion. Truth had triumphed over deception. Justice had been served despite the most elaborate criminal machinations, and London could rest easier knowing that my friend's methods had once again proven superior to even the most sophisticated conspiracy. The criminals were imprisoned, the evidence catalogued, and Miss Constance Fairweather could finally rest in peace. Her brilliant mind honored rather than exploited, her integrity restored to its rightful place among the scholarly community she had served so faithfully.